Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, New Strategies for Reading Aloud to K-2 Students. My name is Catherine Gewirtz, and I'm an Associate Editor here at Education Week. I'm happy to be moderating today. Underwriting for today's webinar has been provided by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. A couple of quick technical things before we get into the subject matter. We want this webinar to be an interactive experience, so please don't be shy about asking questions at any time. All you have to do is type into that box on your screen that says Ask a Question. If you're having any audio trouble, please check the audio setting on your computer, as well as your speaker volume settings. If you're still having trouble, see our audio troubleshooting file, which is in the Handouts folder at the bottom of the console. You'll see some other icons on the console that could be useful too. The Bio panel lets you read about today's speakers. To download a copy of today's slides, click the Handouts panel. You can also follow the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag EWWebinar. Finally, an archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. Okay, now we've got business out of the way, let's turn our attention to new ways of reading aloud to our youngest students. As you probably know, one of the central expectations of the Common Core in English language arts is that students are able to mine text deeply for meaning and cite evidence from it when they discuss it or write about it. That means teachers have to learn to ask different kinds of questions to help students develop those skills. Instead of asking them, for instance, how they feel about the story or its characters, they need to focus on trying to find the things in a story that convey what it means. This isn't a challenge just for middle or high school teachers. It's affecting practice all the way down to kindergarten. Our two guests today are working at the leading edge of this new practice and have interesting work to share with us about how read-alouds can support the Common Core. Our first guest, Meredith Lieben, is the Director of Literacy for Student Achievement Partners, a New York City-based nonprofit that supports districts as they put the Common Core into practice. She helped launch the Read-Aloud Project, better known as RAP, a free online bank of read-aloud lessons for grades K-2 written by teachers across the country. Our second guest, Nikki Longmore, is a second-grade teacher at Ruby Duncan Elementary School in Las Vegas. She is one of two teachers that I watched as they used the Read-Aloud Project at their school, and I wrote about their work in a story last spring. We've included a link to that story in the slides for this webinar in case you'd like to read it afterwards. We'll start with Meredith. She'll give us an overview of the Read-Aloud Project. Then Nikki will share what it's like to use those lessons at the classroom level. Meredith, why don't you get us started?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. So we're going to jump right in with what is this thing? What is the Read-Aloud Project? It is coordinated by a partnership with Student Achievement Partners and the Council of the Great City Schools, but it's for everybody, and there are participants who build lessons, and everybody has access, which I will show you in just a few minutes. Everybody can access the lessons for themselves, and as many people as can make it happen can join in the building of the lessons as well. So it is collaborative, it's teacher-led, and it builds interactive read-aloud lessons for K-2 classrooms. So far we have created over 120 lessons which are stored on Achieve the Core and Edmodo. Again, I'll show you those in a few minutes. And what they're designed to do is demonstrate how the literacy strands are designed to work together, how interactive they're meant to be. They almost could be thought of as age-appropriate, close reading experiences with great text, great books, and great stories, great articles, whatever it is the teacher wants to bring to life in her classroom for her students. There are some important characteristics I want to point out, as well as these things that are listed on this slide. The text is read multiple times, and it's funny that kids are instinctively always ask for their favorite books to be read over and over, and we do that, but we don't always do it mindfully and deliberately. With the Read-Aloud Project, Each reading is for a different purpose, and it's very mindful. So the first read, there are some principles, design principles. The first read is always for enjoyment. It should be as uninterrupted as possible and all the way through, except for chapter books, of course. So the idea is that kids get to experience the whole story or all the information available to them in the article or the informational book, and get to enjoy it. Because a lot of this is intended to cultivate love of reading and the idea that reading is just the most spectacular thing humans can do just about. Each time that there's a lesson afterward, and these are designed to be 15 or 20 minutes a day, but Nikki will talk more about the specifics of that. Every time the story is read afterwards, there's a planned purpose and a focus for the reading. Vocabulary exploration should be one of the earliest focuses, so all students have access to the rich language and ideas in the reading. The idea here is, of course, that students can access information and ideas that they can't access through their own eyes independently yet because they haven't yet learned to read this stuff. So this is how students get access to complex text in K-2 grades, or as long as it needs till they can read rich stuff for themselves. So this is all about access. So vocabulary should be early. We always build in attention to syntax and to interesting parts of syntax. How many words are there in the longest sentence? Let's count them. Listen to what my voice does when it gets to these commas. What's happening? So kids pick up all that ancillary knowledge along with the story itself. And those two are particularly vital, as I'm sure everybody is aware, because they are the factors that cause children most comprehension difficulty, especially for students who are acquiring English as a second or third language. Those are the key factors for anybody, but especially for English language learners. They're vital. So we pay careful attention to vocabulary acquisition and to syntax. Rich questions about what's going on in the story or what kind of learnings available are asked throughout. And in every phase, every time it's read, children are given the chance to talk about and be active around the readings each time. So these are very social and very interactive. And as I said initially, they do demonstrate the literacy strands: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And a lot of the lessons bring the arts and dramatic play in as well. The other thing is we pay attention to showing teachers how informational text can come alive in the classroom. So science and social studies topics are drawn from, we did a 50-state study of the most common topics in states' social studies and science standards, and the next generation science standards if you're from a state that uses those. And the topics that we develop, the read-alouds from, are often around those topics, so that so the informational text might actually align to what you're supposed to be teaching in your classrooms anyway. So moving on, what's the need that the Read Aloud project fills? We do want to offer a new way to think about reading aloud to students. Many teachers understand how vital reading aloud is. I think every teacher understands that. But few of us are in the habit of designing our read-alouds in as purposeful a way as we design other parts of our school day. This work is very mindful. The RAP lessons all begin with the end in mind. Nod to Grant Wiggins' work, Understanding by Design, and Backwards Design, whatever you call it. The lessons are all built around a central understanding that the people who developed the lessons believe the author had in mind, and the readings work together to build towards that understanding. So they really are well-crafted lessons and go deep. And as you'll find out in a bit, they're also very adaptable to whatever your own purposes are. We think there's tons of confusion, rightfully so, for how foundational reading and the ELA standards are designed to work together with the Common Core. And the K-2 teachers have had a particular challenge since whenever your state adopted. So the message with the Read-Aloud Project is those two strands work together by being distinct, actually. They have different jobs to do. The parts of your day that are to do with teaching children to read are vitally important. And that's not the Read Aloud project. The Read Aloud is for reading to learn and reading to really question the text and exercise all the ELA standards, the 10 reading, 10 writing, 6 language, 6 speaking and listening standards. We do think it's important for K-2 teachers to understand what is meant by college and career readiness when the children you work with are 4 or 5 years old. That's gotten a lot of play, and it feels a little bit jarring and off-putting. So we wanted to actually say, no, this is what it looks like. It's fun, it's active, it's playful, but it is language rich, it is vocabulary rich, and it is deliberate. It really is deliberate and careful teaching. We also wanted, in a little bit of a, we wanted to undo some of that damage that's been caused by No Child Left Behind and the rigid 90-minute literacy blocks where people have been told in many districts that they can't read about science or social studies. They can't read about the world. We think everybody, all of us who've ever taught children, everybody on the phone, on the webinar, wants to open the classroom doors, open the world to your children, and we think Reading Aloud is a brilliant way to do that. Reading is the best way humans have yet invented to connect to other places and other times. And we want to show kids that you can go anywhere and travel to any point in the past or future through the pages of a book. You can go inside a volcano. You can ride horses with ancient sultans. You can experience another person's joy. All children deserve access to this through Reading Aloud, and the best of all is they deserve to access it independently for themselves. So that's, again, the foundational skills will provide that. Although we don't emphasize informational text, we do often show matchings or pairings. Because reading books about stuff, informational text is a vital component of this work. And we believe in developing these lessons that children like to learn about the world. We also think boys sometimes see themselves as non-readers because they like reading about stuff and how the world works more than they like stories, and they think reading means reading stories. So we want to make sure that we address that, and we have found that girls like all kinds of reading if they're exposed to both. So we don't, we want all kinds of books in play. Because we want to show kids that there's all kinds of ways to learn. So moving along, we're going to move faster now. These are the 2 content-heavy slides. And these slides will probably be what you want to download and go back to, because unless you can scribble like mad, you're not going to have a chance to internalize this. So where do I access these lessons? That's really important. There's 2 places. You can actually get to Edmodo through Achieve the Core. Edmodo is essentially, if you don't know it, a teacher community. You can set up pages for your own classroom, or in our case, we've set up teacher communities and we store the lessons in folders there. And through Achieve the Core, which is Student Achievement Partners' website of Common Core resources. So I'm going to talk you through Achieve the Core first. That's the link there. And you basically pick, it's hard to see the screenshot, at least on my computer, but you can register or you can just search. There's actually a search function, but you basically select, once you're in and you say you're an ELA teacher, you want ELA stuff, you'll get this screen, and you select try this in your classroom and you'll go to sample lessons, if you see the lesson tag. And then there is a lesson bank, so you basically can search for lessons organized by topic for early elementary if you're interested, again, in the science and social studies work, or you can search for lessons to use with Read Aloud stories as well. So there's multiple pathways in once you're in there, and then you choose a book title. If you see this one's searching by subject, obviously, so it's animals, and then you can link and search and pull and click on one of the lessons. And then you download the lesson plan, and they all are formatted to look like this. I'm not going to go through them because you can see them for yourself, But you can see how many standards are addressed here, and you can see the strands. There's lots of reading standards, some writing standards, lots of speaking and listening standards, and some language standards, all addressed during the week that you would spend with your children with this lesson. A butterfly is patient. If you go in through the RAP community on Edmodo, you have to set up a free teacher account at Edmodo, and you do that. This is the welcome screen. If you don't have an account at all, you have to register. And on the left of your home screen, once you've registered, you'll have a groups tab, and it's under your name and your picture if you've chosen to upload a picture of yourself or an icon. There's a plus sign, and this group code is very important because it gets you, we're not a restricted group at all, but you do have to know the code because there's so many pages on Edmodo, and PKX52I is the Edmodo, is the Read Aloud code. And then once you're in there, there are folders on the left side, and you do essentially the same thing. It's the Read Aloud Project. If you're on any other Edmodo groups, you have to pick the right folder, and you will go in, and if there's any dialogue about it, once you're in the group, you can see that. And again, once you find the folders, they're organized similarly to the way they are on Achieve the Core. These are by topic, and here's animals again, because we're going to get to the same end place. And once you click on it, you will see the very same lesson plan arrived at that way. So if you already use Edmodo and you're comfortable, that's a great way in. You don't have to register on Achieve the Core, so that's a good way in. And last, I wanted to leave you with a few additional resources. Both And is a paper talking about the strain, I think like another strain of trying to keep a balanced literacy approach while you do Common Core type work, and this is a paper that explores that and has lots and lots of pragmatic ideas for learning centers and how to group and when to do this kind of complex text, and a little bit of discussion on mixed ability groups versus other types of arrangements. So it's just a useful paper. And then the Matthew Effect is a video that presents the research and explaining why it's so crucial to build vocabulary and knowledge as early as possible. So those are links to where those can be found, and another link to Achieve the Core. And if you have any other questions offline, you can contact me directly. And now it is on to Nikki's part of the presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Meredith. That was interesting. I just want to remind everyone before we move on to Nikki, see that little box on your console that says Ask a Question? If you have any questions about Meredith's part of the presentation, that's where you type them in and submit them for the Q&A part of this webinar. So throw your questions in there, and we'll get on to Nikki. Tell us about using RAP in your classroom, Nikki.
All right. Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Let's just dive right in because I've got a lot of wonderful information that I want to share with you. So a lot of you are probably wondering, what is the difference between a RAP and a traditional read aloud? Well, as Meredith said, a RAP is purposely and deliberately planned. The lessons are designed with instruction in mind that allows your students to draw out the big idea from the text versus a read aloud where it's common for a teacher to just pull a book off the shelf that's enjoyable for the students. It covers a variety of standards. In a RAP, standards are addressed in all ELA domains as well as occasionally science and social studies. There's a big focus on incorporating more writing into the lessons. In a traditional read aloud, a few reading standards are usually the primary focus. A RAP is more focused on skills and knowledge. With the RAP, the focus is on drawing out the purpose of the text rather than what the students think or might already know about the concept or topic because of previous experiences. So in a sense, it's leveling the playing field for all students. Text-dependent questions. When using your RAP, you're going to be asking questions that can only be answered through the use of the text. And inferences are also going to be based on evidence from the text rather than your students' personal feelings and or previous knowledge. So for example, as teachers, we're usually asking questions such as, how do you think this made Ruby feel? And now we're going to be asking questions like, what evidence in the text tells us how this made Ruby feel? So the students are always going to have to go back to the text in order to find evidence to support their answers. Complex text. With the RAP, the texts are more complex than with the traditional read aloud. A RAP is that's been designed for second grade is generally going to be 2 to 3 grade levels above the reading level of the students. Essentially text that the students otherwise wouldn't be able to access without having it read to them. Rather than just picking up a book for enjoyment that's on the student's reading level as we would with a traditional read aloud. And lastly, the vocabulary. As Meredith mentioned before, there is a strong emphasis on vocabulary, but that the vocabulary is embedded in the lesson rather than us just teaching a predetermined list of words. All right, ways to use a RAP lesson. You can use it as is, modify it to meet your students' needs, or writing your own. Using the RAP as is, you can still modify it a little bit to meet your students' needs. As Meredith discussed, there are multiple RAPs for K-2, which are located on Edmodo, and they can be used how they're written with minimal need to modify them. You can also modify, for example, our second grade team wanted to use the RAP, A Secret Life of a Snowflake. However, as we began planning it as a team, we felt like the way that the RAP was written, that it required some specific background knowledge regarding snow that perhaps our students wouldn't be familiar with because we live in the desert. So we decided to make a few modifications to make this text more meaningful for our students. Writing your own. For example, the story of Ruby Bridges is the RAP that we're going to go through in a few minutes, and this one was written by us from scratch. This process is hard and it's time-consuming, but it's one of the most worthwhile experiences that I've had. After writing it, the purpose of the RAP has kind of come full circle for me, that this really was not an ordinary read-aloud, that while planning it, it was very deliberate and purposeful, and that the experience that my students were going to get by teaching this way, they would never be able to do it had we not written it. As a teacher, there are a few things we need to keep in mind. You need to be sure that you plan, prepare, and be ready for amazing learning to take place if you do this. Take the time to read the text more than once. Read through the lesson plan more than once. Make notes on the lesson. Put post-it notes in the text, whatever planning that you feel you need to do in order to be successful. The first RAP that I actually did was The Secret Life of a Snowflake, and there were scribble marks from top to bottom on every page of the RAP. Another thing that's really important is to be reflective every day after your lesson. If you plan to use the RAP exactly the way it was planned, the students may take you in a little different direction, and although they're still learning, you need to be prepared as the teacher to gently guide them back towards the understanding and the big idea of the actual RAP. All right, the RAP in action. At this point, we're going to walk through the RAP, the story of Ruby Bridges. There was a little bit of front-loading that we felt we needed to do, so we decided to show a couple of video clips to introduce Ruby and also provide a little background knowledge to students on racism. So on the first page of the RAP, you're going to see all the standards that are covered, the suggested time to spend on the RAP as Meredith discussed previously, the lesson objective, and the big idea, key understanding, or focusing questions. One thing that I do want to point out is, as you see all the standards listed at the top, the RL 2.1 or RI 2.1, you're going to see those two standards listed generally on every RAP, because basically this is essentially asking text-dependent questions, students being able to answer those who, what, where, when, and why questions and support it with key details in the text. All right, I'm not sure if you can see it real well, but basically this is what the format is going to look like for your first read. And one thing I wanted to point out is that normally, and Meredith mentioned this as well, the first read is intended to be for enjoyment only. Introduce your students to the text, get them interested, However, because we needed to front load so much information about segregation, desegregation, and integration, we were able to find some images and a couple of videos that would provide an example in order to spark some discussion with our students. We were concerned that if we didn't do this with the first read, that it might be more difficult for the students to successfully examine the text more carefully. Right. During the second read, you can see on the slide over on the right-hand side, it looks like a T-chart, if you guys can see it very well, and it's the graphic organizer that we designed for the RAP. During the second read, the students are going to be focusing on segregation in the 1960s in order to understand the challenges that Ruby faced. As Meredith talked about before as well, each reading is deliberately planned for something to happen with the text. So the first read was for enjoyment. The second read is for the students to focus on segregation in the 1960s and so on. With this graphic organizer, I was able to provide some scaffolding for the students by using the chart whole group, as well as providing the chart for the students to use as a note-taking device that they would later use to complete the culminating activity. And one thing you want to keep in mind as well is that all of the activities that you do during the RAP is leading the students to the completion of the culminating activity. Additional reads with the text and reading text-dependent questions. Additional reads with this text included rereading the entire text to help students understand and identify the characteristics that helped Ruby to overcome the challenges that and the students discussed during the previous readings. At this point, I also want to take a second to discuss vocabulary. I know I briefly talked about it being embedded in the lessons versus teaching a predetermined list of words, but the vocabulary here is broken up into Tier 1 and Tier 2 words. Tier 1 words being simpler words for the students to understand, such as maybe sight words or things like that, and then words that warrant more time that students might see across multiple disciplines, or perhaps words that have multiple meanings, the Tier 2 words. These are the words that we chose to show the videos on during the first read. We thought that the words would be easier for our students to understand if they were able to see it versus just giving them a definition. I have to be honest, before teaching multiple RAPs in my classroom, I didn't really understand exactly how the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 vocabulary should be taught, but as a result of using that in this way, it's much more clear now. So the culminating task for the book was that the students were required to write to describe the challenges that Ruby faced in the United States when she was 6 years old. What characteristics helped her to overcome these challenges, and how did her actions affect others? Be sure to use examples from the text to support your answers. So students were required to write about this, and the T-chart was a key note-taking device in order to help students organize their thoughts and prepare to write. On the next slide, there's a sample response that's provided in order to help the teacher understand and know where the student's writing should maybe be going. And I didn't mention this a few slides ago, but if when you guys print the slides, or if you want to go back and look, on the right-hand side, every text-dependent question that was written has a sample student response. So when you're planning and preparing what it might look like in your classroom, you'll be able to know where your students are supposed to be going with it. So like I said, in the sample student response, you're going to notice that all the answers are supported with specific evidence from the text. All right, benefits of a RAP. We've got teacher benefits and student benefits. The quality of instruction, I could see that the quality of instruction that was being provided to my students based on the student discourse that was happening and the quality of the culminating activity that was produced. The student discourse that happened during this RAP was phenomenal. There were a lot of days that I sat in front of my students in complete awe with the conversations that were taking place. The Read-Aloud versus the RAP. Once you teach it, to be honest, you have to actually teach one in order to just see the difference. The RAP focuses on student learning. It was very eye-opening to me to see what these kids could do. I had no idea that my students were capable of having such meaningful discussions about such complex issues such as racism. And this was a huge benefit to me as a teacher. It encouraged me to always push them a little farther than maybe I would have before using a RAP in my classroom. And for a lot of us, multiple standards, I mean, we all know that the reality is that we need to be able to teach multiple standards during each lesson. There's not enough time in the day to teach individual standards, and a RAP does a great job with that. You really get a lot of bang for your buck. Student benefits, access to text. You know, we've talked about this several times. There's no way that my students would have been able to access this text and to gain the knowledge and experience of this text had it not been done in this format. Student discourse, huge amounts of student discourse. I can't emphasize how eye-opening it was to me to see that these students were truly capable of doing this based on the scaffolding and the way this was written. The writing portion of it during the culminating activity, so much was learned from the students' writing based on the text, which helped me to see a better picture of the impact that it made on the students. And the connections that the kids were able to make with the real world. I mean, as adults, we understand racism is still something that's very real. However, 7-year-olds really, they don't understand. And it was amazing to me that as a classroom community, the understanding of racism that they had, one specific sentence during the closing of one of their culminating activities was, "I can't imagine treating Josephina the way that Ruby was treated." And Josephina is an African-American student in my classroom, and the students really struggled with the fact that in the 1960s that this is how she would have been treated. If anyone has any additional questions or would like more information on using the RAP in their classroom, my email is listed. Please feel free to contact me.
Great. Thank you so much, Nikki. Such an interesting presentation. And I'll just jump in and say, too, that anyone who wants to read more in depth about this and also see a video clip of another teacher at Ruby Duncan, a kindergarten teacher, Jamie Londahl, doing a lesson with kids, should click on my story, and we've got that URL here. I've got a whole story from Ruby Duncan plus that video clip, so you might find it interesting to see that in action. But let's start taking questions. Those were great presentations, and we got a ton of interesting questions. So how about this one for you, for Nikki? Someone wants to know, did you teach about segregation before the first read or after?
That was the purpose of showing some of the videos, and there were several videos that were listed in the RAP that they could access, and so we did do a little bit of front loading and have some discussion about that, just to kind of get the juices flowing for them and to generate some discussion about that.
Okay, thank you. A number of people have been asking about books, too, so let me sort of throw two questions about books in here, and let's get Meredith to address this question. One of the questions, Meredith, is, do you need to have the book for the RAP? And another person asks, do the RAP lessons include the books? Not quite sure what they mean. If there's
So I do. That's a constant nagging teacher problem.
Great.
Resources. So one of the things we love about the Read Aloud project is that it requires one book because it is Read Aloud. So it is much cheaper than other forms of Common Core alignment work where you might have to buy a whole new whatever. You can do this with just one book. So if you look through the 120 lessons, there are lots of books that are sort of crowd favorites that you probably have access to in your classroom or school library or public library. I know a lot of us are teaching in places where library budgets have been decimated. The books do not come with the lessons because we did not could not chase permissions for whole books. Nobody will give that to us. So this is something I know in Clark County in Las Vegas, where Nikki is. The district has invested a lot in books since Common Core. And the other thing you can do if you really have no money and nothing at all to read out loud to your students is go up the hall to the older grades and read and grab great stuff from their rooms just to borrow for a while. To read to your own students, because Nikki's point that the whole idea here is that kids are getting read to them things that they cannot access on their own. So second graders are hopefully reading on their own. They should do lots and lots of that. That is one of the great pleasures and work of being a student, both. But the read aloud should be harder than almost anybody in the room could access on their own. That's a key ingredient of this. You might have everybody has second graders that are reading 5th and 6th, 7th grade level, those kids. That's not who this is designed for. This is designed for the kids that are reading, Henry and Mudge. That's not what you would read aloud to them. You would let them read that themselves, and you would pick harder and richer books, maybe more chapter books, more meaty books. And then in K and 1, you read whatever you want, as long as it's rich and complex enough to engage the kids in these series of lessons.
Thanks, Meredith. Here's one for you, Nikki. Someone's asking, and maybe you could give us sort of a picture of how this is happening in the classroom. Someone's asking, do students have a copy of the text so that they can find evidence from it?
As Meredith talked about before, there's only one text required for the RAP. However, that's kind of how we have chosen to, depending on what we chose for the note-taking device or things like that, all of the questions that were asked during this specific RAP, again, led them to the culminating activity, and so they were able to use that note-taking device to be able to answer those questions. So one side was the question, and then the other side of the T-chart was the answer of the question.
I think maybe the person was asking, does each child have a copy of the text in their lap so they can flip back and forth through the pages and look for the evidence? Or is the teacher sitting up in the front with the only copy that the class is discussing that day?
I understand. The teacher has the only copy of the text.
Okay.
The discussion is going to be very specific as to what is going to be happening that day. So the teacher is able to go back and forth and work through it with the kids rather than them doing it on their own.
Okay. Meredith, maybe you could catch this one. This question is, how is this different from shared reading?
Well, one thing is that it is read aloud. So the kids, it is not about building reading fluency. And none of this is one particular part of the school day. We recommend it be maybe 20 minutes a day as part of a language-rich classroom. If you're reading science and social studies informational text, it should happen. Reading aloud can happen during science and social studies blocks, so those don't get shoved off and lost in the. So the other potential here is to really blow up the school day schedule and expand reading opportunities and language-rich opportunities across the whole day, and not just the literacy block. So it doesn't replace shared reading at all, and it's not about fluency. It's not about kids gaining skills on their own, except comprehension skills, deep comprehension skills. But they're developing oral comprehension skills. So, and I wanted to add on to what Nikki said before. The teacher supplies the multiple readings, and if they're focusing on one chunk of the text, the teacher would do that. I have seen projections onto smartboards so that kids could see illustrations for themselves, or teachers doing that thing we all do of just reproducing the illustrations so the kids could work with them, for example, in kindergarten, and cue off them. And the book's always available if students are off working on their own, but there's no requirement that every child have the book. Children need print materials in front of them a lot, but not for read aloud.
Okay, thank you. Nikki, someone's asking, maybe you could give some examples of what you use in your classroom. Someone's asking, how will you check to see if all students understand? Will students write any answers to teacher questions? I mean, I remember watching you in your classroom when children were doing a drawing activity and they were doing some writing in response to the reading that you all did together.
Absolutely. It is very interactive. It's not, again, it's not teacher-centered. It's very student-centered. And what you're referring to is we did a rap, 14 Cows for America, and it was, part of the purpose was for the students to understand past tense versus present tense, and so they had to be able to represent past tense and present tense in an illustration that they were drawing about September 11th. So they do daily based on whatever the activity is or what the focus is for that day's reading. They may produce an illustration, they may produce a writing, it may be a lot of student discourse. It just really depends on what your focus is for that day.
Okay, thank you. Meredith, this is a good one for you. Someone's asking, what is the process for vetting or revising the lessons that teachers, well, she said submit, but I know that they write them together collaboratively.
Right, so that's a great question.
And how do they get revised?
So when we hold trainings, they're 2-day-long trainings where we really walk everybody through the research behind all this in much more detail than we've done today. And people come in teams from their districts. We will love it when librarians come too. But groups of teachers, coaches, curriculum people, whoever can come. And they start the writing there, and there's no reason people couldn't do this independently. We have table coaches that are at the training, and those are also our reviewers. So, and they're almost all of them, basically all of them are graduates of these lesson writings themselves. We just keep an eye out for talent and then say, hey, would you mind reviewing and being a critical friend to another writing team? So when you write a lesson and submit it, you get that friendly coach, that reviewer, who looks at your drafts and makes comments and gives you feedback. So that's really rich professional learning, as you can imagine. So usually the revising goes through, depends, 2 or 3 drafts before it's posted on Edmodo, and the writing team and the reviewer both have to feel that it's really, as good as it can be. And we don't go after perfect. We just want really solid approaches to these books so that so kids can glory in the books when they're exposed to them.
Thanks. Meredith, I want to ask you to consider this question, too, and respond. And Nikki, you're more than welcome to jump in and respond to this one as well. Here's someone saying, I can't help wondering whether read-alouds do develop a love of reading as against a love of story, and whether this approach might have the opposite effect. So how about if you each take a whack at that? Does this really develop a love of reading, a love of story, or does it risk turning kids off to loving reading?
Well, I'll let Nikki take the second part because she has visceral, probably, response to it. It's not a love of story because we really encourage reading informational text, and we do think that we early childhood people have to fight against ourselves because we have a love of story to the exclusion of other things, and often don't think about how much fun it can be to teach a book about a construction site or how water moves through a city or, through the aquifer. And kids love those things. So part of what we're trying to model is that whole 50-50 thing that the Common Core requires, that kids be exposed to 50% of what they're exposed to be informational text. Here's how you can do it. It's joyous. Try it with your kids and see how they respond. And sometimes we have to get out of our kids' way. So it's not designed to cultivate a love of story at all, as opposed to a love of reading. Yeah, this I believe pretty passionately, because this levels the playing field. It wipes out any learning problems kids have, any kids that aren't fluent yet or haven't broken the code yet in 2nd grade, for example. And I've taught up the grades. I read aloud everywhere I teach, including community college. Because it levels the playing field, and yes, it allows everybody equal access to the ideas and the richness that print has to offer us. So I passionately believe it cultivates a love of reading. And Nikki can respond to whether this approach turns kids off, because she's been living it in her classroom.
I would definitely say it does not turn kids off. I have seen students grab books out of the classroom library that have shocked me, that I would have never expected them to choose, based on the fact that it may have something to do with a read aloud that we had done prior to that. Asking questions to me about the text, asking questions to their peers about the text, conversations happening during center time about text that they're reading, conversations happening on the playground about the text that they're reading. So I really feel like that this opens their eyes to a whole new world of how they can actually use text. So my personal experience has been that they thoroughly enjoy it, and it definitely is not a turn-off, but encourages them to read more, and probably things that they wouldn't choose to read otherwise.
Great. Well, I want to combine two questions that are coming in, and I'm going to put these for you, Nikki, as our classroom practitioner, and they have to do with vocabulary. One person is asking, I'm finding their question again, if you could talk a bit more about how RAP supports vocabulary development, and the other one is asking if grade level Tier 2 words are targeted. So could you combine those and talk a little bit about exactly how you bring vocabulary into a RAP lesson?
Well, I'm going to be honest, depending on your students, sometimes the vocabulary is a little bit difficult. However, like we talked about before, the Tier 1 vocabulary is words that, that should be easy for them to understand. Because the text is 2 to 3 grade levels higher, they may not be sight words or common words that they would recognize, yet if they're mentioned and told the meaning, they understand. The Tier 2 vocabulary is specific to the text for the most part, in the sense that they need the background and understanding of those words in order to be able to analyze this text for understanding. Depending on the text, for example, like I said, when we did Ruby Bridges, we really felt like we needed to do a better job with those words such as racism and desegregation and things like that, and use different things rather than just explicit instruction on those words, such as the photographs and the videos, and letting the kids hear and feel what racism was like and what it was like for students to be segregated from other students. So I think when it comes to teaching those vocabulary words, that sometimes you just have to use your teacher knowledge and what you know about your students in order to determine exactly how you're going to teach those.
Great, thank you. Here's one for you, Meredith. Does every read aloud have to be a lesson? Can't students just enjoy a story now and then?
Absolutely. I am a big
those kind of questions.
Yes, one of my favorite things in education is we have way too much either or. Everything should be both and. Of course, sometimes you just grab Mufalo's Beautiful Daughters because it's a beautiful story and kids love it, and there's no lesson out of it. It is just relaxation and pure enjoyment. A lot of this came, from sort of observation. It is research-based. Somebody asked that in the stream. This is based on sound research, these principles. But they're also based on the weird division between what we as teachers do for our own children and nephews and nieces, grandchildren, et cetera, at home, and how differently we approach reading aloud when we're in front of kids at school who probably need it more than our own children do. So that's really baked in, is that kind of, kids are allowed to ask questions, they're allowed to wonder, they're allowed to interact with the text, the words are defined for them, and they explore the book at leisure over and over again. So all that stuff's baked in. And yes, of course, sometimes you just read because it's a lovely thing to do, and you want to, and the kids want to.
Great, thank you. One of the things I'll tell everyone just from me here, that when having gone out to Las Vegas and watched, I saw very clearly that the first read is just for pleasure, exactly that, just for the fun, for the love of it, and they start digging in with more questions and redirection back to the text on the second and subsequent reads. So here's another question. What about shared inquiry? Does this approach include shared inquiry? where the teacher's facilitating the reading sessions and allowing students the chance to ask questions among themselves? Either or both of you could take a whack at that if you have thoughts.
I'll take a whack at it first.
Okay.
I think definitely. While I said in my slideshow that you have to be prepared to lead your kid back to the big idea or the focus question, there is a lot of student discourse happening, and it's okay to answer those questions and to allow the kids to have that conversation, and maybe some other things will come up, and that's okay. But you just need to be sure that you're cognizant of what the focus of the lesson is supposed to be, and not to kind of let it get out of control, and keep the kids focused on your focus question or your big idea.
Anything, Meredith, or shall I move on?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. There were a number of questions that came in. I want to just sort of blend them together into one and let, Meredith, maybe you should start with this, and then Nikki, if you have something in your day-to-day practice to add, please, by all means. But the questions are about how appropriate is this, and how can it be adapted for English language learners and students with special needs?
Yeah, I'll happily take that to begin. It makes the world accessible to those kids because everything is available, again, through ear. If I am in a situation where I have lots and lots of English language learners, I would tilt toward reading more informational text about concrete things, because kids can then map onto their own and stories that they could map onto so that they could build vocabulary. I would also adapt and pay much more attention to syntax and vocabulary to make sure the kids were with me. We actually paid attention to Lucy Wong Fillmore, who's a Meredith ELL and brilliant professor from Berkeley, who talks about the juicy sentence that you can take with the kids to unpack it for syntax and rich examination. I would probably build that in daily, with each, pick a sentence from the story that I could use as my juicy sentence and have the kids really play with it. So it suits ELL kids. I think it can be modified easily to work with kids who are just entry level or whatever level they are at, including up the ladder in older grades.
Okay. Anything there, Nikki, or shall we move on?
Just to piggyback off of what Meredith said, it's actually amazing for your ELL students because it's very scaffolded. Fortunately, there's so much student discourse happening that the kids are learning from each other as well and having those conversations with each other. And because the student discourse is usually the turn and talk to your partner or, your peanut butter jelly partners, whatever you're doing in your classroom, it's safe. And so your ELL students are willing to have a conversation with someone that's sitting, 2 inches away from them versus, having to speak out in the whole entire class when they're not really sure if maybe they understand, or even if, maybe they don't understand exactly how to say what it is that they want to say. I have many ELL students in my classroom, I'm sure as most people do, and it was very beneficial to them.
Great. Now, Nikki, someone's asking, how are you choosing books to read? Are they written into the lessons? I mean, a lot of the folks asking questions haven't had a chance to go in and see the RAP lessons yet written out, so I think they're not sure what's included. How are you choosing books to read for RAP?
Well, when we plan as a grade level, we talk about, what kind of things that we would like to do, but I mean, really it's standards-based. What do we need to cover in our classroom? And if we could choose a RAP, for example, The Secret Life of a Snowflake, we were able to cover like 4 science standards along with some informational text standards and all of these other standards. So, I mean, it was basically we chose based on what our students' needs were and the standards that we still needed to cover in our classrooms.
Okay. Now,
and just a lot of people search by what the books they have, and then they search for lessons to match the books that they have.
So you can go the opposite way.
Yeah.
What about parents? Someone's asking, how do you share, or Nikki, have you shared this reading style with parents so they can easily and comfortably engage in a similar way of reading when they're home with their kids. Anybody work with parents on this? Has anyone worked with parents on this? And in other words, is it easy to teach parents how to do this? And has anyone done that so that they can read the same way at home with their children?
We have shared what we're doing with our parents. As far as teaching them, how to do it, I have not done that. I think maybe that might be something interesting to try. I think that there are some parents that would certainly be interested in trying maybe to make the read aloud a little richer in their home as they're reading to their kids. I think that parents also probably want to do that typical, your son or daughter curls up on your lap and you read them a good book just because it's fun to read to them.
Mm-hmm. Here's one for you, Meredith. I'm going to read it to you. I work in an urban setting where fall testing shows that over 85% of students are in the low and below category in reading. Teachers focus on retelling and basic comprehension skills. How feasible is it to believe that the majority of our students can focus mainly on higher order thinking questions? It's important, and students can do this after a lot of prompting, but my teachers need to focus on foundational reading skills.
Well, again, it's I think it's a both and. The kids, they're not going to, especially if they're older and are struggling with reading, it's really easy to lose the purpose for all that struggle and not make it productive, right? If all you're doing is drilling and going over and over and over the stuff that you're bad at all the time, that's hard. In the before Common Core, but I remember one kid in my 5th grade who came in new, and he was absolutely illiterate. And I read out loud constantly. As I said, every grade I taught. And that kid just about was like, I don't know, he was like on my knees or sitting on my feet when I would read aloud. I mean, he was so hungry for that part of the day because he was absolutely an intelligent kid, and he could access the world through his ears, where he couldn't access it yet through his eyes. So again, yes, the kids need to learn to read, and they need lots of work on that, but they have to remember what reading's for and the joy it's going to bring them. And my own child was in a LD school because he was child of parents, of educators that he could not write his own name in 2nd grade. And they were very clear and said, do not drill and skill your kid at home. Just read out loud to them and make them enjoy words. Do not do anything. We will take care of that during the day. You make sure they remember how fun reading is. So I just think there's something to that, and schools can just, we can become dreary places for kids if we don't remember how painful life can be if you're stuck facing your deficits all the time.
Well, that is a great note to end on, and we have enough questions and enough interest. We could go on for another half hour, but we got to stay within our hour, so I've got to wrap up today. And I want to thank our presenters, Meredith Lieben and Nikki Longmore, and all of you. What great questions. This was a good discussion. I want to remind you, too, that an archive of today's discussion and the slides are going to be available at edweek.org within 24 hours. And there's a slide right here that we're just about to show that links to our recent special report on early literacy. There's a whole suite of stories in there, including the one that I wrote from Ruby Duncan with that video clip I talked to you about, so you might want to check that out. So look forward to being able to look at the slides on edweek.org, and thank you again, everyone. And